the manager who made the decision to terminate Mr. Ormsby, and an HR manager gave evidence about these purported gang links. And the authority member, rightly so, said, well, this seems to have been part of your decision making.
Sean Brooks, Special Counsel for Buddle Findlay, joins me to discuss a case concerning a Fonterra employee who won a substantial personal grievance when he was not presented with a chance to defend himself against the belief he had gang affiliations. Sean, thank you very much for joining us. Look, can you just give us a quick outline of this case, please?
Sure. So Mr. Ormsby in this case was a Fonterra employee. He sounds to have had some difficulties in the workplace. He sounds to have been a relatively difficult employee to manage. And over the previous 6 years leading up to his termination, on 4 other occasions, he had warnings or letters of expectation about the way in which he interacted with his managers and the other people that he worked with. And on this occasion, the employer took a harder line and investigated allegations of Mr. Ormsby not complying with his manager's instructions and behaving in an aggressive and intimidating manner against or towards another employee.
So if we look back at the things that he'd done just briefly, I mean, it seemed that when he was pulled up on it, he did apologise, and that's why it had sort of slid under the carpet, if you like, for 4 years or whatever it was, many years.
Yeah, and it wasn't really high-level bullying and intimidatory type behaviour. But one of the criticisms that the authority did have of Fonterra was that this sort of behaviour of Mr. Ormsby's was brought to its attention on a number of occasions, but it didn't take any formal steps to try and help him with those type of behaviours. So there was no formal training or any guidance or tuition of any sort about how he can improve his behaviour. So there are no repeats.
So what happened in the most recent event that took it beyond the others?
I think it was probably the culmination of behaviours for Fonterra. The employees who made the complaints in this case, there were 2 separate employees. One of them felt he was being bullied and harassed and intimidated, and he felt fearful for his safety is one of the things that he said. And then his line manager, as I understand it, was the other person who made the complaint, and that was for failing to do what he was told, essentially. So the line manager was having real difficulty managing this employee and felt there was some insubordination from him. So it was a culmination of those things that led to the investigation by the employer. And I think the employer got to the end of that investigation. Mr. Ormsby had accepted the conduct. He had accepted he said the things that he was alleged to have said, but he disagreed that they were serious misconduct, and he disagreed that he said them in a threatening way and that he didn't swear, he didn't threaten violence, he was never going to be violent towards anyone.
So that might have been one thing, but then another element came into this case, which was about gang affiliations. Now, explain how that played out.
Sure. Yeah, that's a really interesting part of this case because it seems that the management at Fonterra for Mr. Ormsby had it in their mind through rumours and other discussions around the workplace, not with Mr. Ormsby, that Mr. Ormsby had gang associations, and whether they were, he had his own links to gangs, or whether they were his friends and the people outside his workplace that he knew were associated with gangs. There was also an incident at a work event where it was said he made a barking noise when someone received an award, and again, that was linked to a gang noise. But none of that was put to Mr. Ormsby in the disciplinary investigation that the employer carried out. So the employer found that there was serious misconduct and terminated Mr. Ormsby. And then when the Employment Relations Authority investigated this matter, the manager who made the decision to terminate Mr. Ormsby, and the manager who made the decision to terminate Mr. Ormsby, and an HR manager gave evidence about these purported gang links. And the authority member, rightly so, said, well, this seems to have been part of your decision making. Was this discussed with Mr. Ormsby? And it appears it was not. So while it came into the decision making, Mr. Ormsby wasn't given a chance to defend himself in relation to those alleged gang links.
Should gang links be part of an employer's deliberation on somebody, or is there a lot of sort of there are ways that must be thought about?
I think being a member of a criminal organisation would certainly be something that the employer would be able to take into account. But just having associates or friends or family who might have those gang links, that might be a bigger stretch to bring into the employment relationship and into part of a disciplinary investigation. But in this case, the alleged conduct was intimidatory and threatening type behaviour. So I think it did have an undercurrent or a relevance in this case.
Right. I mean, if the company had asked him, are you affiliated with a gang? And he said no, that would have covered off their bases. The case might have turned out differently.
I think potentially it could have, because that was one of the key things that the authority found, that the employer had these concerns and it didn't give Mr. Ormsby a chance to explain himself. And what Mr. Ormsby said to the authority was that absolutely he didn't have any association with gangs. He said he did have associates that many, many years ago were linked, or I think it was family members, were linked to a gang, not the gang that was in question in this case. And he said he has no other links to gangs and there's no other reasonable explanation why he would.
Right.
One thing that was in the news at the time was another Mr. Ormsby in that area who was linked to the mongrel mob and had been convicted of crimes, and it mentioned his brothers, but that was no one that the Mr. Ormsby who worked for Fonterra knew or was associated with.
Right. So he won his personal grievance. Does that mean he got his job back? He got a whole lot of money. Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
So what can employers take from this?
I think there's a couple of key takeaways from this. The first one, I think if an employer is investigating any sort of conduct, it needs to put all of the circumstances that it's thinking about that are weighing into its decision in front of the employee before it makes its decision, and give the employee the opportunity to comment on those things. And I think that would have alleviated the key issues that Fonterra had with this case. I think the second key takeaway for employers in this case is about training. So we saw in this instance, there were 4 or 5 different instances where there was really similar conduct and really similar concerns. And I think Fonterra dealt with those probably in an appropriate manner at the time. So a letter of expectation and a first warning, sort of recognizing that these are relatively low level behavioral things that the employee needs to improve on. But it didn't take that follow-up step of saying, well, what can we do to support this employee to make sure that they are meeting those behavior expectations? And it could have just been some low-level coaching. It could have been a course, mentoring. There could have been some follow-up. And that didn't come through in the evidence from what I could see. So the employer was criticised for that.
For more content just like this and all the latest business and political news, head over to mbr.co.nz.